Fire Emblem is a massive series. It's been going for a long time, first releasing in 1990 on the Famicom, but not every Fire Emblem has made it to North America. In fact, many of them haven't, and not just at the beginning either. We're going to be talking about 4 of those games in this video, and remember, you can play them right now with fan translations. The first game that I want to start off with is one of the games that really cemented many of the systems we see in modern Fire Emblem. That is, of course, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. Genealogy of the Holy War was the first time Fire Emblem started using the Holy Trinity, not in the MMO sense. This is a system where swords beat axes, axes beat lances, and lances beat swords. Not only that, but it also introduced the skill system, so now characters would have skills based on the class or job they have. One of the most unique things is the generation system. For the first part of the game, you play as the main character. Then, depending on which pairing you get through the marriage mechanic, there's an entire second campaign with the child of your main character. This is definitely one that Fire Emblem fans should experience, and it was the last Fire Emblem that Gunpei Yokoi, the famous Nintendo designer, worked on. You can play it in English right now because there is a fan translation for the Super Famicom. The next game that we're going to be talking about is the infamous Thracia 776. We're very lucky that this one got fan translated at all, because it was apparently a very difficult undertaking, with many calling it the white whale of the Fire Emblem series, and then when it did get here, we realized that the real white whale was beating the game. Thracia 776 is well known for being one of the most difficult Fire Emblem games. It has one of my favorite tropes, the rebel group fighting against the Empire. For some reason, it always gets me, whether it's Suikoden, Star Wars, or Fire Emblem. Thracia 776 is difficult for many reasons, one of them being the fatigue system. Once a character reaches a certain amount of fatigue, they become unavailable for the next chapter, requiring you to use different characters, not just the strongest characters, all in one team at all times. You're also a smaller force, which reflects the story of rebellion, limited resources, and there are optional objectives that you'll want to do, which are also difficult. So if you like a challenge, make sure to play Fire Emblem Thracia 776, which has also been fan translated on the Super Famicom. The next game is a bit of a weird one to explain, so stick with me here. This Fire Emblem game is the second appearance of what is probably the most famous character from the series, Marth. But there are actually multiple different versions of that story. There's Mystery of the Emblem, which was released for the Super Famicom. Part of it is a retelling of the first Fire Emblem game, and the second part, also called Book 2, which is a whole new story. There is no official localization, but there is a fan translation of that. Then, there's Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem, which is a remake of the second half of that, Book 2, for the Nintendo DS, which has no official translation, but does have a fan translation. So you have a few options here depending on what you like. If you want to see the original, it's out there and translated. Many people recommend the newer version for the Nintendo DS. There are multiple reasons for that. The most simple reason is quality of life. There are a lot of upgrades to the systems to make them easier to use on the Nintendo DS. There are also story additions which add to the game, including a player-made avatar named Chris. Some people like the addition of Chris, some feel like it takes away from the other characters, so that could be one reason to play a different version, but there's so much character interaction and story added, I think it's probably worth it to play the newer version. And within New Mystery of the Emblem, you also get new chapters and maps based on the Satellaview Fire Emblem, called BS Fire Emblem. Satellaview was this peripheral for the Super Famicom that allowed you to download games. This was during the 90s, so that's some good old technology. So what I would probably do is play the DS version of the original Fire Emblem, which is Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, and then play New Mystery of the Emblem, so you get the second part of that story. You can play the fan-translated Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem on Nintendo DS. And of course, we have to mention one of the other Fire Emblem characters, also to feature in Super Smash Bros., Roy and Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, which was actually the first game to feature Roy because the prequel that was released in English actually was released After this, a bit confusing, especially because the Binding Blade was not officially localized. Either way, the Binding Blade is actually a really solid Fire Emblem game. It takes a bit of a step back from the systems of Thracia 776, favoring a more accessible approach, but not being overly easy either. It has a lot of the fundamentals that later Fire Emblem games would iterate on. It's probably one of the best starting points for people that want to play Fire Emblem, because it can serve as a gateway to the older games or the newer games, and it's just a good game in its own right. Plus, you could play the officially translated to English prequel first, and then go straight into the next part, which is the Binding Blade. The Binding Blade has a really iconic art style as well. Being on the Game Boy Advance, it has some very nice sprite work. Overall, a Fire Emblem game I definitely recommend. You can play Fire Emblem The Binding Blade on Game Boy Advance, but only in English through fan translation. There are other fan translations, but most of them are covered in other ways. For example, there's Fire Emblem Gaiden, which has a remake on the 3DS called Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia, or the Satellaview game that was integrated into New Mystery of the Emblem, and then, of course, the original Fire Emblem for the NES, which wasn't released in English until Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, which is a remake. So, through fan translations, you could experience the original Fire Emblem, or there's a version of it on the Switch that was officially localized. I know it's all kind of confusing, but so is the history of Fire Emblem. The best place to start is, of course, with what interests you the most, but for the easiest intro to Fire Emblem fan translations, Fire Emblem 6 The Binding Blade is probably a good place to begin. Unless you really love a challenge, then maybe Thracia 776 could be more your style. Obviously, if you really like the original story, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, you could play New Mystery of the Emblem. So, those are some good places to start. I would go with one of those probably, and then work your way towards something more difficult. maybe even work your way up to Thracia. If you have any experiences with these fan-translated Fire Emblem games, let me know which you enjoyed the most in the comments, or if you have a good recommendation for where people should start. I do videos like this and on RPGs of all kinds, so subscribe if you like them too. Thanks for watching.